A steel door slides open for the 15,330th time. Albert Woodfox, now 69 years old, steps out of 6 by 9 foot concrete tomb. He's been locked in solitary confinement longer than anyone in American history. 43 years. 15,729 days. Alone. But this morning is different. This morning, he's walking out a free man. The question that haunts everyone who hears this story: how does a human mind survive that long in isolation without breaking? The answer lies in a single act of defiance that happened on April 17, 1972, a day that would seal his fate and test the absolute limits of human endurance. For decades earlier, Albert Woodfox was just another young black man serving time in Louisiana's brutal prison system. 25 years old, convicted of armed robbery, he'd been transferred to the Louisiana State Penitentiary, Angola, just 3 weeks prior. Angola wasn't just any prison. Built on a former slave plantation, it was known as the bloodiest prison in America. Stabbings were daily. Guards turned blind eyes to rape. And if you were black in 1972 Angola, you had two choices: join a gang for protection or die trying to stay neutral. Albert chose a third path. In the prison library, he discovered the Black Panther Party's writings. Malcolm X, George Jackson, revolutionary texts that reframed his entire existence. He wasn't just an inmate. He was a political prisoner in a system designed to warehouse black bodies. Within days, he connected with two other inmates, Herman Wallace and Robert King. Together, they formed the Angola chapter of the Black Panther Party. They didn't carry weapons. They organized. They taught other inmates to read. They demanded basic human rights, proper medical care, and end to rape, edible food. The prison guards called them troublemakers. The inmates called them the Angola Three. Brent Miller was different from other guards. Only 23 years old, he'd been working at Angola for less than a year. Some inmates said he was fair. Others said he was just young and scared. That morning, Miller reported for duty at Cell Block C, the most violent section of Angola. The air was electric with tension. A white inmate had been killed by black inmates 2 days prior. Retaliation was coming. Everyone knew it. At 7:45 a.m., Miller walked down the Pine 1 tier to conduct a routine count. He never walked back. 6 minutes. That's how long it took for everything to fall apart. Inmates heard screaming, then silence. When guards finally stormed Pine 1, they found Brent Miller's body. He'd been stabbed 32 times with a homemade shank. Blood pooled on the concrete floor. The prison went into immediate lockdown. Warden C. Murray Henderson didn't just want justice, he wanted revenge. And he knew exactly who to blame: the organizers, the troublemakers, the Angola Three. Within hours, Albert Woodfox, Herman Wallace, and Robert King were pulled from their cells and thrown into solitary confinement. No evidence, no investigation, just 3 Black Panthers locked in cages. What happened next would keep Albert locked in solitary for 4 decades. But the evidence that convicted him, it would shock you. Subscribe so you don't miss how this story ends, because the truth is darker than you imagine. The investigation into Brent Miller's murder was a sham from day one. Lead investigator Lieutenant Hezekiah Brown had a clear directive: pin this on the Black Panthers. No physical evidence connected Albert, Herman, or Robert to the crime scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon traced to them. But in 1972 Angola, evidence was optional. What mattered was control. The Black Panther organizing had to be crushed, and solitary confinement was the hammer. As Albert sat in his 6 by 9 cell that first night, he had no idea this wouldn't be a temporary punishment. This would become his entire life. Hezekiah Brown needed a witness. He found one in Hezekiah Brown, no relation, a convicted rapist serving life. The deal was simple: testify that you saw Albert Woodfox and Herman Wallace murder Brent Miller, and we'll reduce your security classification, move you to a better cell, maybe even cut some time. The inmate agreed. His testimony would be the only evidence at trial. Never mind that his story changed 3 times. Never mind that he later admitted he was coerced. Never mind that he recanted entirely in 2008, saying, I lied because they threatened me. By then, Albert had already been in solitary for 36 years. Albert's trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution's case rested entirely on the coerced testimony and circumstantial evidence. The defense pointed out glaring inconsistencies. Witnesses who placed Albert nowhere near the murder scene. The lack of physical evidence. The racial bias permeating every aspect of the case. None of it mattered. The all-white jury deliberated for 90 minutes before returning a guilty verdict. Murder, conspiracy, life in prison. But the real sentence wasn't the conviction. It was the classification that followed. The warden stamped Albert's file. Extended lockdown. Indefinite solitary confinement. Threat to institutional security. Albert was 26 years old. He wouldn't see another human being without bars between them for 43 years. 6 feet wide, 9 feet long. A concrete slab for a bed. A metal toilet. A sink. No windows except a tiny slit in the steel door. This was Albert's world now. 23 hours a day in this box. 1 hour outside in a cage they called a recreation yard. A concrete pen with chain-link fencing overhead. No human contact. No phone calls. Letters were heavily censored. Books were forbidden for months at a time as punishment. The silence was the worst part. In the early days, Albert would scream just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. Other inmates did the same. The solitary wing echoed with the sounds of men losing their minds. 18 months in, Albert woke up at 2:34 a.m. and couldn't remember his mother's face. He'd been dreaming about her. He knew that. But when he tried to picture her, there was nothing. Just blank space where her features should be. Panic set in. He tried to remember his daughter's laugh. His brother's voice. Nothing. The isolation was erasing his memories. Psychologists call it social death. What happens when the brain, starved of human interaction, begins to cannibalize itself. Albert realized something that night. Angola wanted him to break. They wanted him to lose his mind, to become the violent animal they claimed he was. So he made a decision. He would fight, not with fists, with his mind. Albert created a routine. Every morning, 5:30 a.m. sharp, 100 push-ups, 100 sit-ups, 100 squats. Mental exercises followed. He'd recite multiplication tables, list every state capital, name every player on the 1968 Detroit Tigers roster. Anything to keep his mind sharp. When books were allowed, he read everything: law texts, history, philosophy. He learned about habeas corpus, due process, the Eighth Amendment. If Angola wanted to bury him alive, he'd become a lawyer in a cage. He filed his first appeal himself in 1975. It was denied. He filed again in 1976. Denied. He would file appeals for the next 41 years. Each denial another day in the box. Each denial another reason to keep fighting. Herman Wallace was in the cell next to Albert's. His co-defendant. His brother in the Angola 3. Through the concrete walls, they talked. Not about the case. Not about appeals. About life. Herman would tell stories about growing up in New Orleans. Albert would share memories of his grandmother's cooking. They debated politics, discussed philosophy, argued about basketball. That wall became a lifeline. As long as Herman was there, Albert wasn't alone. They made a pact. Neither would let the other break. They'd walk out of Angola together, but they died trying. For the next 37 years, that promise kept them both alive. Angola's guards had ways of breaking resistant inmates. Cell extractions. That's what they called it when 6 guards in full riot gear stormed a cell, beat an inmate unconscious, and dragged him to another unit. Albert experienced his first extraction in 1980 after refusing to stop his legal work. They burst in at 10:15 a.m., baton swinging. He tried to protect his head. They broke 2 of his ribs. When it was over, they threw him in the hole, a punishment cell even smaller than his regular one. No mattress, no sink, just concrete and darkness. 3 days. When he returned to his cell, his legal papers were gone. Destroyed. 8 months of work. He started over the next morning. The 1980s blurred into the 1990s. Albert turned 30 in solitary. Then 40. Then 50. Outside, the world transformed. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. The internet was invented. Nelson Mandela walked free after 27 years in prison, 16 years less than Albert would serve. Inside Camp J, nothing changed. Same concrete walls, same metal door, same breakfast at 6 a.m., lunch at 11 a.m., dinner at 4 p.m. The same faces of guards who cycled through, young men becoming old men while Albert remained frozen in his cage. Some guards were cruel, others were indifferent. A few showed quiet kindness. An extra book slipped through the slot, a conversation that lasted 5 minutes instead of 2. Those small mercies kept him human. 29 years in solitary. Albert received news that would change everything. A federal judge had overturned his conviction. The evidence was tainted. The witness had been coerced. After 3 decades, he was going to walk free. He packed his few belongings, legal papers, a handful of books, photos of family members he hadn't touched in 29 years. The cell door opened. For the first time since 1972, Albert Woodfox walked down a prison corridor as a free man. He made it exactly 45 feet before guards grabbed him. The state of Louisiana was re-indicting him. Same charge, same evidence, same all-white jury pool. He was going back to the box. Albert's fight was far from over. What happened in the next 15 years would test everything he'd built. If you want to see how a human being survives the impossible, hit subscribe because this story goes places you won't believe. Conviction overturned. Retried. Convicted again. Appeal filed. Conviction overturned again on racial discrimination grounds. The prosecutor had systematically excluded black jurors. Third trial ordered. Convicted once more. By 2008, Albert had been convicted 3 separate times for the same murder, with each conviction later being overturned by federal courts. He'd also been in solitary for 36 years, 9 years longer than Nelson Mandela, longer than any prisoner in the history of American incarceration. Amnesty International called it torture. The United Nations declared it a violation of human rights. Louisiana called it justice. And Albert went back to his cell. Herman Wallace won his appeal. After 41 years in solitary, a federal judge ordered his immediate release. Albert heard the news through the walls. For the first time in decades, he'd be alone. No voice next door. No debates about politics or stories about New Orleans. Just silence. Herman was dying, liver cancer, stage 4. The state had fought his release until the very end, arguing he was still dangerous despite being unable to walk unassisted. He died 3 days after his release, free for exactly 72 hours. Albert attended the funeral in shackles. When he returned to Camp J, Herman's cell remained empty. The silence was unbearable. But Albert had made a promise. He'd keep fighting. For Herman. For Brent Miller's family, who deserved the truth. For himself. 43 years. Federal courts had overturned Albert's conviction 3 times. Each time, Louisiana re-indicted him. Each time, he went back to solitary. Now 68 years old, his body was failing. Arthritis from sleeping on concrete for 4 decades. Hypertension, chronic pain, but his mind remained sharp. He'd become an expert in constitutional law, better versed in habeas corpus than most practicing attorneys. His legal team, a coalition of civil rights lawyers who'd worked pro bono for 2 decades, filed one final motion. Release him or give him a fair trial with an untainted jury. No more all-white juries. No more coerced witnesses. Real justice. The state faced a choice. After 43 years, Louisiana blinked. The state offered a deal, plead no contest to manslaughter and conspiracy. Not guilty, no contest. Acknowledge the state could have convicted you without admitting you did it. In exchange, immediate release. Time served. After 43 years, Albert faced an impossible choice. Accept a plea to a crime he maintained he didn't commit, or stay in solitary indefinitely fighting for exoneration. He was 69 years old. His health was deteriorating. Herman was dead. Robert King, the 3rd member of the Angola 3, had been released in 2001 after 29 years. Albert's lawyers laid out the reality. He could die in this cell waiting for a justice system that had failed him for 4 decades. Or he could walk out tomorrow. He had 12 hours to decide. Albert sat on his concrete bunk. 15,728 nights in this box. Tomorrow would be 15,729, or it would be his last. He thought about Brent Miller, a 23-year-old kid who never got to go home. Someone killed him, and that person was never truly held accountable. Albert thought about Herman, who died 3 days after tasting freedom. He thought about his daughter, now in her 50s, who'd never known her father outside prison walls. He thought about the principle of the thing, standing firm, refusing to give the state the satisfaction of even a qualified admission. Then he thought about the sun, real sunlight, not filtered through a door slot, the sound of rain, the taste of food not served through bars. At midnight, he made his decision. His last morning began like all the others. 5:30 a.m. Push-ups, sit-ups, squats. But today, each movement felt different. The last push-up in this cell, the last sit-up on this concrete. He washed his face in the metal sink one final time. Put on the street clothes his lawyers had brought, jeans and a button-up shirt that felt strange after decades in prison khakis. At 6:47 a.m., the steel door slid open. The guard who'd escorted him to the shower 1,000 times looked at him differently today. Not as inmate number 72148, as a man about to walk free. "You ready, Woodfox?" Albert picked up his box of belongings, legal papers, a few photos, 3 books. "I've been ready for 43 years. The walk from Camp J to the processing center was 400 feet. Albert had walked it 3 times before, each time in shackles, heading to court, only to return. This time, no shackles. No guards flanking him with hands on batons. Just a walk. Other inmates pressed faces against cell door windows. Some shouted encouragement. Some just watched in silence. Albert moved slowly, deliberately. This corridor had been his entire universe for 15,729 days. Every crack in the concrete was familiar. Every fluorescent light. He passed Herman's old cell. Empty now. He paused for just a moment. "We made it, brother," he whispered. Then he kept walking, toward the steel door at the end, toward freedom, toward a world he hadn't touched in 43 years. The processing officer was young enough to be Albert's grandson. He slid forms across the desk. "Sign here, and here. This acknowledges you're being released on your own recognizance. This is your no-contest plea agreement. This lists your parole conditions." Albert signed. After 4 decades of fighting, it came down to signatures on forms. The officer handed him an envelope. "Your release funds. $47.50. Bus ticket to New Orleans is $35 if you need it. $47.50. For 43 years of life." The officer looked uncomfortable. "Look, man, I just want to say, what they did to you is wrong." Albert met his eyes. "Then make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The young man nodded. Albert wasn't sure he believed him. The final door. Steel, reinforced, designed to keep men in. A guard pressed the release button. The lock disengaged with a clunk that echoed through Albert's chest. The door swung open. Sunlight poured in, real, unfiltered sunlight that made Albert shield his eyes. He hadn't felt natural light on his skin in 43 years. The heat of it, the warmth. He stepped through the threshold. His lawyer was waiting outside. Friend from the legal team. Supporters who'd fought for his release. They applauded. Some cried. Albert stood there, blinking in the Louisiana sun, trying to process that this was real. No bars. No concrete walls. No guards. Just open space. "How does it feel?" a reporter shouted. Albert took a breath. "Ask me in a year," he said. The parking lot of West Feliciana Parish Detention Center wasn't beautiful. Cracked asphalt. A few scattered cars. But to Albert, it was vast. Infinite. No walls containing the horizon. He walked to an empty patch of grass. Real grass. Not the concrete pen they called a recreation yard. He knelt down and touched it. Felt the blades between his fingers. The texture. The green. A lawyer approached. "Albert, we have a car waiting. We should get you out of here." But Albert stayed kneeling, feeling grass for the first time since 1972. "Just another minute," he said. "I need another minute." They gave him space. Let him have that minute with the grass and the sun and the sky that went on forever. The car ride to New Orleans took 90 minutes. Albert sat in the back seat, watching the world blur past at 70 miles per hour. Everything had changed. Gas stations with digital signs. Cars with designs he didn't recognize. People on phones, not just talking, but staring at screens. His lawyer explained. Smartphones, the internet, social media, GPS. The world had lived 43 years while Albert stayed frozen. Trees looked the same, though. The Mississippi River, glimpsed from the highway, still flowed brown and eternal. Some things survived unchanged. Albert wondered if he was one of them, or if 43 years in a box had fundamentally altered what it meant to be Albert Woodfox. He'd find out soon enough. His daughter was waiting at the safe house. Brenda. She was 52 years old now. Last time he'd held her, she was 9. She stood when he entered. They looked at each other across the room, strangers connected by blood and 43 years of absence. "Daddy," she said. The word broke something in Albert. He crossed the room. They embraced. She sobbed into his shoulder. He held her like she was still 9, like he could make up for 4 decades with one hug. "I'm sorry," he kept saying. "I'm so sorry." She pulled back, tears streaming. "You survived. That's all that matters. You survived." Later, they sat at a table. A real table, not a metal tray passed through a slot. She told him about her life. Her children. His grandchildren he'd never met. He listened, trying to piece together the life that happened without him. Albert couldn't sleep. The bed was too soft. The room was too big, at least 12 feet by 12 feet, double his cell. The silence was wrong. No guards walking tears. No inmates muttering in adjacent cells. No metal doors clanging. Just quiet. He got up, paced. Tried the bed again. Too exposed. Too vulnerable. At 2 a.m., he took the blanket and pillow and moved to the closet. 6 feet by 3 feet. Closer to what he knew. He lay on the closet floor, pulled the door mostly closed, and finally fell asleep. In the morning, Brenda found him there. She didn't say anything, just left a pillow outside the closet. It would take Albert 3 years before he could sleep in an actual bed. Adjusting to freedom was harder than surviving solitary. In the box, the rules were clear. In the world, there were too many choices. Too many people. Too much noise. Albert's first trip to a grocery store lasted 5 minutes before he had a panic attack. The fluorescent lights. The crowds. The overwhelming array of products. 47 types of cereal when he'd eaten the same prison oatmeal for 43 years. He left without buying anything. A therapist later explained, institutionalization. His brain had adapted to captivity so thoroughly that freedom felt like chaos. Simple tasks, using an ATM, ordering food at a restaurant, crossing a busy street, required intense concentration. But Albert had survived 43 years in hell. He could learn to survive this too. 3 years after his release, Albert Woodfox stood on a stage before 500 people. Activists, lawyers, formerly incarcerated individuals, people fighting to end solitary confinement. "They took 43 years from me," he said. 15,729 days in a box. "They thought they could break me, make me less than human. But here's what they didn't understand. Humanity isn't something that can be taken. It's something you choose. Every single day, I chose to stay human. I chose to keep fighting. I chose to believe that justice, even if delayed, would come." The audience was silent. Brent Miller deserved justice. He deserved a real investigation, a real trial, real accountability. He didn't get it, and that's a tragedy that can never be fixed. But I'm here today to make sure no one else, guilty or innocent, spends 43 years in a concrete box. Because that's not justice. That's torture. The room erupted in applause. Albert Woodfox had survived the longest solitary confinement in American history. But survival wasn't enough. Now he was making sure it never happened again. He was 72 years old, still fighting, still human, still free. Albert Woodfox's story is one of the most extreme cases of solitary confinement in history, but it's not the only one. Thousands of people are in solitary right now. If this story impacted you, subscribe to hear more stories that expose the truth about America's prison system. because these stories need to be told.